I just finished an 18-hour shift at the trauma center, coordinating 3 life flight choppers through a thunderstorm. Before I stepped into the suffocating warmth of the Mercer family dinner, my boots were still heavy from the hospital floor, and my brain was still calculating fuel loads. But my mother, Martha, didn't ask if I was tired. She shoved a glossy menu into my hand and pointed at the most expensive aged ribeye, her eyes gleaming with a predatory kind of pride. "Quinn, thank God you're here. We already ordered the vintage Cabernet because we knew you'd want to celebrate your sister's big news," she said, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that always preceded a request for money. I looked at the table, seeing my father Silas already halfway through a bottle of bourbon and Piper preening in a new silk dress that probably cost more than her monthly rent. I didn't realize coordinating a logistics fleet at a Tier 1 hospital qualified me as the family bank. "Mom, but I suppose the wine is already uncorked," I replied, my voice raspy and stripped of any patience. Piper leaned across the white linen, her smile as sharp as a razor blade while she flashed a new designer clutch at me. "Don't be so Midwestern grim. Quinn, I'm practically an executive now, and this dinner is a small price to pay for family unity," she chirped. Though we both knew her executive role was just a glorified internship, I didn't smile back. Instead, I pulled a heavy, cream-colored envelope from my tactical bag and slid it across the table until it hit her wine glass with a dull thud. "If you're so executive, Piper, maybe you can explain why a debt collection agency sent this $2,500 notice for a delinquent credit line opened with my social security number," I stated, the silence following my words, hitting the room like a physical blow. Martha's face drained of color as she snatched the paper, her hand trembling while she tried to tuck it under her napkin. "Now, Quinn, your sister just needed a little bridge loan to keep up appearances for her new job. There's no need to make a scene in a place like this," my mother whispered, her eyes darting around to see if any of her social circle had heard us. I leaned in, my shadow falling over the table as I locked eyes with Silas, who suddenly found his drink very interesting. "Appearances don't pay federal fraud charges, and neither do I. So you have exactly 5 minutes to decide how you're going to pay this $2,500 bill and the $500 dinner tab," I said, my tone as cold and precise as a triage report. Silas finally looked up, his jaw set in that stubborn, defensive line I'd seen 1,000 times before when he was caught in a lie. "You've got a penthouse and a salary that could fund a small army. So stop acting like a victim over a few $1,000s. He spat, his voice rising just enough to turn heads at the next table. I stood up, adjusting the strap of my bag, and looked down at the people who had spent my entire life treating me like an invisible resource. "I am a logistics coordinator, Silas, which means I know exactly when to cut a failing route to save the rest of the fleet. And as of this second, the Mercer family is officially off the map," I said before walking toward the exit without looking back. I spent my days in a high-pressure glass box overlooking the Chicago skyline, managing the pulse of the city's medical emergency network. My world was a grid of moving icons representing life and death, where a 10-second delay in a blood shipment meant a funeral in the suburbs. To my colleagues, I was the pilot of the logistics cockpit. But to my family, I was just Quinn on the phone. They saw my headset as a symbol of clerical insignificance rather than the headset of a woman redirecting $15 million assets to save lives. Piper once called me during a mass casualty drill just to complain that her dry cleaning wasn't ready on time. "I'm currently routing an organ transplant across 3 state lines. Piper, I literally cannot care about your silk blouse," I told her while my screens flashed red with urgency. She didn't even pause, her voice an airy contrast to the sirens screaming in the background of my office. "Well, you're already at a desk, So it's not like you're actually doing surgery or anything important. She snapped before hanging up. I realized then that their ignorance wasn't a mistake. It was a choice they made to keep me in a box they could control. Silas and Martha treated my career like a hobby, a convenient source of overtime cash they could tap whenever a water heater broke or a vacation called. They never asked about the pressure or the lives saved. Only about the benefits package and why I wasn't using it to pay for Piper's dental work. You work in healthcare. So, isn't everything free for you anyway? Martha asked me once with a straight face during Sunday brunch. I stood in the center of my command hub, watching a helicopter land on a rooftop 3 miles away, feeling the immense weight of 1,000 moving parts. My life was built on precision, on knowing exactly where every dollar and every heartbeat was at any given microsecond. Meanwhile, Piper was drifting through a life of unearned luxury, leaving a trail of unpaid invoices and forged signatures in her wake. I started to wonder how many more of my emergency funds had been diverted to fuel her delusions of grandeur. If they think I'm invisible, I'll show them exactly what happens when the person running the system walks away. I whispered to the empty room as I pulled up my personal credit report. The data didn't lie. There were $12,000 in suspicious charges tied to a mailing address I hadn't lived at in a decade. It was the Mercer way. Use the quiet one, the reliable one, and then act shocked when she finally counts the cost. I didn't call them to argue. And I didn't send a warning text, because in my world, you don't warn the obstacle, you just clear it. I watched the blinking lights on my console, realizing my family was just another logistics error that needed to be corrected. The route is blocked, and I'm not the one who's going to pay the toll this time, I muttered, closing the file on my sister's latest fraudulent scheme. I walked into my River North loft to find the heavy steel door ajar and the scent of Martha's cheap perfume clashing with my expensive leather upholstery. Piper was lounging on my velvet sofa, a glass of my $400 scotch in her hand, while Silas poked at my custom flight path monitors like they were toys. How did you get in here? And why are you touching my equipment? Silas? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous register as I dropped my tactical bag by the door. Martha emerged from my kitchen, wiping a smudge off a marble counter with a look of pure indignation. Your grandmother June gave us the spare key for emergencies. Quinn. But I didn't realize the emergency was you hiding a $2 million lifestyle from your own flesh and blood. She snapped, gesturing to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I ignored her and walked straight to Piper, snatching the scotch from her hand before she could take another sip. The emergency is that you're trespassing. Piper. So put the glass down and tell me why you're digging through my private files, I said, noticing my laptop was open to the Mercer Medical Trust portal. Piper didn't flinch. She stood up, her eyes bright with a frantic, desperate greed that made my skin crawl. I saw the balance in that charity account. Quinn, there's over $500,000 just sitting there while I'm drowning in debt, and Silas needs a new truck, she yelled, her voice echoing off the industrial ceilings. I stared at her, realized she'd been trying to bypass the multi-factor authentication for the nonprofit fund I managed for underprivileged patients. That money isn't mine. It's for people who can't afford heart valves. Not for your failed vanity projects and Silas's midlife crisis, I replied, slamming the laptop shut with a sharp crack. Silas stepped toward me, his face reddening as he tried to use his physical bulk to intimidate me just like he did when I was 10. You're the trustee, which means you can authorize a consulting fee for your sister and help us get our heads above water for once, he growled, his breath smelling of the liquor he'd stolen from my cabinet. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that stopped him in his tracks as I pulled out my phone to check the security logs. You actually think I'd commit federal embezzlement to fund your laziness after you stole my identity to buy a European vacation? I asked, showing them the screen where the police dispatch was already acknowledging my silent alarm. Martha gasped, clutching her throat as if she were the victim of a great injustice. "You would really call the cops on your family over a little bit of paperwork and a nice apartment?" she whimpered, her tears appearing right on cue. I walked to the door and held it open, the cold hallway air rushing into the heated room. "I coordinate life flights for a living, Martha. So I'm very comfortable making the call on who gets saved and who gets left behind," I stated, my eyes fixed on Piper's trembling hands. Piper grabbed her designer bag, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred as she marched toward the exit. "You think you're so much better than us because you have a view of the lake. But you're just a cold, lonely bitch who's going to die with nothing but her spreadsheets." She spat as she passed me. I didn't blink, my gaze remaining steady as Silas and Martha shuffled out behind her, looking smaller than they ever had. I'd rather be lonely in a penthouse than a fraud in a courtroom. And Piper. I'd start looking for a lawyer because that trust fund has an automatic audit trigger, I said, closing the steel door and turning the deadbolt with a final, satisfying click. The next morning, I sat in my command center and began the process of deconstructing the Mercer parasite network with the same precision I used to clear air corridors for emergency arrivals. I watched the digital pings as Piper tried to access the Mercer Medical Trust for a second time from her office computer, unaware that I had converted the account into a honeypot trap. She's actually doing it. She's trying to authorize a $15,000 consultancy payment to her personal LLC, I muttered, my fingers flying across the keys to capture the IP address and time-stamped keystrokes. I didn't just block the transfer. I rerouted the transaction failure notification directly to the compliance officer at the entertainment firm where she worked. 10 minutes later, my phone shrieked with a call from Martha, her voice a jagged edge of panic and accusation. "Quinn, what have you done? Piper just got escorted out of her building by security and they're talking about a police report," she screamed into my ear. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, watching a satellite feed of a storm front moving over the Midwest. I didn't do anything but set up a standard security protocol. "Martha, but if Piper is stealing from a registered 501c3 nonprofit, that's a federal matter now," I replied, my voice a flat line of professional indifference. Martha let out a choked sob, the sound of a woman seeing her golden child's pedestal crumble into the Chicago dirt. "You have to call them. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you gave her permission to use the money for a family emergency," she pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of her own lies. I watched a red icon on my screen signal a missed payment on the premium health insurance I'd been covering for my parents. I can't lie to federal investigators. And speaking of emergencies, I've terminated the secondary coverage for your and Silas's medical plans today, I said, hearing the sudden, sharp silence on the other end. A moment later, I heard Silas's muffled roar in the background before he snatched the phone from Martha's hand. "You're cutting off our insurance while I'm waiting for my knee surgery? You're trying to kill us just to prove a point about your damn spreadsheets," he bellowed, the sound of a man who realized his free ride had hit a brick wall at 60 miles per hour. I didn't flinch, my gaze fixed on the logistics map, where every move had a consequence, and every debt had a collector. "You want to live like a king on my dime while you insult my life's work, Silas. So now you can experience the free healthcare system you always claimed was good enough for everyone else," I stated, the cold truth of the $8,000 surgery gap now hanging over his head like a guillotine. He cursed me. A string of bitter, ugly words that only confirmed I was making the right tactical decision to excise the rot. "You're a monster, Quinn. A cold-blooded monster who cares more about a budget than her own father's health." He spat before slamming the phone down. I didn't feel a sting of guilt. I felt the lightness of a heavy load being jettisoned from a failing aircraft to maintain altitude. I spent the next hour drafting a cease and desist letter to Piper regarding my stolen Social Security number. CCing the local district attorney's office for good measure. My inbox began to fill with frantic messages from their socialite friends asking why the Mercer donation to the local gala had been retracted. The truth is a very effective disinfectant. And I'm just turning on the lights, I whispered as I authorized a final lock on my credit files. I looked at the city below, realizing that for the first time in 34 years, no one was holding a knife to my reputation or a hand in my pocket. If they want to play the game of optics, they're about to find out how expensive the truth really is, I said, turning my focus back to the emergency fleet. Christmas Eve arrived like a cold front hitting the lake, and I found myself standing in Martha's cramped living room one last time, the air thick with the smell of desperation and cheap pine. Piper was slumped in an armchair, her eyes rimmed with red and her designer clothes replaced by a nondescript hoodie, looking every bit the fraud I'd exposed. You didn't just get me fired, Quinn. You handed the district attorney a roadmap to my life. And for what? To feel powerful for once? She screamed as soon as I crossed the threshold. I didn't take off my coat, my posture remaining as rigid as a flight controller watching a disaster unfold on a radar screen. I didn't hand them a roadmap, Piper. I handed them a confession you signed yourself when you tried to drain a charity for a down payment on a life you can't afford, I replied, the words landing like lead weights in the small room. Martha rushed over, her hands fluttering like wounded birds as she tried to grab my arm. But I stepped back, maintaining the 3-foot perimeter I'd established years ago. Quinn. Honey. The lawyer said the restitution alone is $45,000. And if you don't withdraw the complaint, your sister could actually go to prison, she wailed, her voice hitting a frequency that made my teeth ache. I looked at the tree, seeing the empty spaces where expensive gifts used to be, now replaced by the grim reality of their bank balances. Then I suggest she starts looking into a public defender. Because I'm not perjurying myself to save a woman who stole my identity before I even had my morning coffee, I said, my voice cutting through her hysterics with surgical precision. Silas emerged from the hallway, leaning heavily on a cane, his face a map of bitterness and physical pain from the surgery he could no longer schedule. You're really going to stand there in your $3,000 boots and watch your own father become a cripple while your sister's life is ruined? He growled, the smell of cheap scotch radiating off him in waves. I turned to face him, seeing the man who had spent decades selling my achievements as his own while treating me like a bothersome footnote. You sold Grandma June's antique silver and her wedding ring to pay for Piper's credit card debt last month, Silas. So don't talk to me about family values, I stated, revealing the piece of information I'd gathered from the pawnshop records I'd tracked down. Martha froze, her eyes darting to Silas, who suddenly couldn't meet her gaze. The secret rot of their house finally exposed in the harsh holiday light. Is that true? Silas? You told me those were in the safe deposit box for Quinn's wedding day, Martha shrieked, her loyalty finally snapping under the weight of his betrayal. Piper jumped up, her face twisting into a mask of frantic rage as she pointed a trembling finger at me. You've been spying on us, tracking our every move like we're some kind of criminals in your little dispatch system, she yelled, her voice cracking with the realization that she'd lost all leverage. I adjusted my watch, noting that I had a flight to catch in 2 hours. A one-way ticket out of their chaos and into a life they would never touch. I didn't have to spy, Piper. I just had to look at the data. And the data says you're all bankrupt morally, financially, and emotionally, I said, my tone as final as a death certificate. Silas swung his cane, hitting a side table and sending a ceramic angel shattering across the floor. Get out of this house, you cold-hearted machine. Get out before I show you what a real father does to a traitor, he roared, his voice breaking with the impotence of a man who had lost his kingdom. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking on the hardwood with a steady, rhythmic confidence that none of them could mimic. I was already gone years ago. Silas. You were just too busy spending my money to notice the seat was empty, I said, pausing with my hand on the brass knob. Martha was sobbing on the floor amidst the broken ceramic, and Piper was staring at the wall. Her future now a series of court dates and debt collectors. Don't call the hospital. Don't call my office. And if you ever use my social security number again, I won't send a letter, I'll send the FBI. I stated, the threat hanging in the cold air like a frozen mist. I stepped out into the Chicago winter, the door clicking shut on the Mercer family for the very last time. The aftermath was as clinical as a forensic report. A series of systemic failures that the Mercer family could no longer patch with lies. Within 3 months, Piper was convicted of felony wire fraud and sentenced to 300 hours of community service and 5 years of strict probation. Her socialite reputation incinerated by the local news headlines. You ruined my life for a drop of water in an ocean of money. Quinn, I hope your penthouse feels like a cage, she hissed during her final frantic voicemail before I blocked her number for good. I didn't feel like a villain. I felt like a technician who had finally removed a corrupted file from a vital hard drive. Silas and Martha were forced to sell the family home to cover the $45,000 restitution and Silas's mounting private medical bills, eventually moving into a grim, one-bedroom rental on the outskirts of the city. Martha called me from a burner phone, her voice sounding thin and defeated against the backdrop of a noisy radiator. We're eating canned soup in a place that smells like damp carpet. Quinn, does your conscience really let you sleep at night knowing your father can barely walk? She asked, her attempt at guilt now lacking its old venom. I looked out at the Chicago River, watching the ice floes break apart under the morning sun, unmoved by her hollow appeal. My conscience is clear because I stopped paying for the fuel that was burning my own house down. Martha, and Silas can walk just fine to the bus stop, I replied before deleting the message. I watched the final digital trail of the Mercers vanish as I wiped my secondary servers and changed my emergency contact information to a private legal firm. The false empire had collapsed, not because of my malice, but because it was built on a foundation of theft that could no longer support its own weight. I sit in the jump seat of a medevac chopper, the roar of the rotors drowning out the ghost of my mother's voice and the bitter echoes of the Mercer name. Below me, the lights of Chicago sprawl like a vast, interconnected circuit board where I finally know exactly where I belong. There are no more fraudulent charges to dispute. No more $2,500 dinners to subsidize. And no more predatory emergencies waiting in my inbox. I've realized that my life was never meant to be a safety net for people who chose to jump without parachutes. The silence in my personal life is no longer a void, but a clean, well-managed air corridor where I can finally breathe. I watch the sun rise over the lake, a cold and brilliant light reflecting off the cockpit glass, signaling a day where my only responsibility is the mission in front of me. I am no longer an invisible resource. I am the pilot of my own survival. Thank you for witnessing Quinlan Mercer's journey from being an invisible resource to the architect of her own justice. True strength isn't just about surviving the storm, but knowing which anchors to cut when they try to pull you under. If you value resilience and the power of walking away, please like and subscribe to join our community of survivors.